Welcome to the Becoming Superhuman podcast, where we interview extraordinary people to bring you the skills and strategies to overcome the impossible. And now, here's your host, Jonathan Levy.
Hey there, super friends, and welcome to the Becoming Superhuman podcast. This is your host, Jonathan Levy. My guest today is Mr. Yuri Marmerstein, an acrobat and gymnast who's made a name for himself as one of the foremost authorities on hand balancing. Yuri's feats, which you can see on his YouTube channel, are absolutely superhuman, but what's more impressive is that despite spending some time training with greats like Kit Lachlan, Olympian Valentin Kirichenko, and Christopher Sommer, Yuri is largely self-taught, and he's teaching people all over the world to perform these seemingly superhuman feats by themselves. What he offers then is a very unique perspective on learning incredible acrobatic and physical feats from someone who was not born into it and who is not trained since the age of 4, like most of the elite gymnasts you may have seen. This interview is very technical and a little bit nerdy, and we go very deep into some of the skills and the path to learning them. But if you've ever dreamed of standing on one hand, doing double backflips, or any other seemingly superhuman gymnastic skill, you'll find the interview to be really fascinating and encouraging. So with that, it's my pleasure to welcome Mr. Yuri Marmerstein. Yuri, welcome to the show. I'm so happy to have you today, and thanks so much for making the time.
Yeah, no problem.
So, for those who aren't familiar, can you tell us a little bit about what you do?
So, at this point, I work as a professional acrobat in Las Vegas, and just as well, I travel and teach seminars around the U.S., around the world. Originally, I come from a self-taught background, so I just kind of was that kid who watched too many Jackie Chan movies and started throwing kicks in his backyard, and it grew from there. And I'm very happy now that I can actually, do what I'm passionate about.
Very, very cool. So let's see. If I read your bio correctly, you are trained in mixed martial arts, capoeira, gymnastics, tumbling, cheerleading, weightlifting, circus arts, dance. Am I missing anything?
It sounds about right. I try to do a little bit of everything. I wouldn't consider myself necessarily high level in any of those categories, but but I've definitely had the perspective of being in them.
Amazing. So what are some of the different things you've learned from each of those disciplines that you've brought into your work?
Well, one thing you learn, you think that it's all connected, and it is in some way, but each skill is individually its own. So thinking that you can apply capoeira principles into gymnastics, to some degree you can, but once you understand the differences between everything, you'll learn that being good at one thing does not make you good in another. And especially, I think it helps me a lot more as a teacher to learn the different perspectives of where some of my students are coming from. So for me, weightlifting may not be a massive part of my program right now, but having experience in that makes me understand better when I have students who want to learn hand balancing, want to learn acrobatics, but they come from weightlifting background. So I can understand a little bit more of where they're coming from.
I see. Interesting. So you mentioned a bit about your program, and you mentioned a bit about hand balancing. So you're training really a lot of acrobatic skills besides hand balancing, correct?
Correct.
But I think you're most known for kind of an expert on training hand balancing. Is that fair to say?
I think it's fair to say. I mean, I hate to put titles on myself because I still consider myself, just a student. But as it turns out, I've thought a lot about this stuff, and I guess more than most people care to think about it. So I would say that's fair.
So what is it about hand balancing? I mean, of all the skills, I also saw you're a very accomplished tumbler. I think I saw you doing the iron cross on the rings. What is it about hand balancing that's kind of captivated your attention?
The difference is, like hand balancing, there's no way to cheat it. I'm a very slow learner. So for me, I have to look at something, I have to apply it, I have to research it, I have to go back. And hand balancing is one of those things that no matter how talented you are, you can't just learn it the first day, right? You can learn a backflip on day one. If you're strong, you can do a body weight snatch on, I don't want to say day one, but probably with sloppy form, you can learn it pretty quickly. And you can't just kick into a handstand and expect to hold it. There's so many fine-tuned adjustments you have to make. It's a body control that you don't have unless you specifically worked on it. And you have to put in a lot of time. But more so than that, it's a lot of psychological limitations compared to physical. So like physically, there's really not anything that holds most people, even the average desk monkey back from doing a handstand. Yeah, maybe their shoulders are a little bit stiff, maybe their wrists are stiff, but there are ways around that. But it's more so that there's a psychological block. And it's what's interesting about doing handstands and teaching handstands especially is that it's not just about, okay, this is the perfect form that we're trying to get to. It's about what can we do with this body type and this psychological profile to get them holding this position safely and confidently.
Mm-hmm. I've noticed that I'm a pretty avid CrossFitter and handstands come up. I think today I did something like 50 handstand push-ups. And I noticed that it's the people who are training with the wall who are not advancing because of exactly what you said. The psychological is not getting trained if you're not learning, like, it's okay to fall, it's okay to move your hands. They're training the physical comfort and I guess not the psychological comfort.
Mm-hmm. It's that, and then I think people don't understand the fine-tuned precision that goes into actually holding it. So like I tell people, and I'm not joking, like you have to move in increments of 1 millimeter. Right. And you can be 1 millimeter off and not be on balance. And I think most people are just kind of too brutish about the way they go about it. Mm-hmm. And it's that precision that like there's no way around putting in the work to be able to achieve it.
Interesting. So I noticed you said that you're a slow learner, which I think is interesting on a couple levels. One, because as you know, I teach a course on accelerated learning. So we're going to have to chat about that. But the other thing is, I was anxious to speak to you because I saw your bio and you actually come out right ahead and say that you weren't particularly athletic as a kid. And if memory serves, you started getting involved in acrobatics and gymnastics towards the end of high school, right?
Correct. Uh-huh.
So that puts you at a huge disadvantage compared with some of these kids who've trained since they could walk. And I guess I'm really interested to hear a bit about your learning methodology, especially because you describe yourself as a slow learner and you've closed that gap. I mean, you're a performing gymnast and acrobat.
I wouldn't quite say I've closed that gap, but I have very high standards and it's hard, right? If you've done something since you were, a little kid, and the difference with learning it as a kid is that you will learn something whether you want to or not. Kids are hardwired to just automatically learn anything. And then the difference as an adult is that you tend to resist learning. Once you pass that certain age, and it's usually around 11 or 12, where you think you know something about the world, that the learning process completely changes.
Right.
With myself, unfortunately, I had no method. I had no program. I had maybe a couple people who could do a backflip and I could watch them and ask questions and they didn't really know what they were talking about that much either. So it was a lot of self-experimentation. So I basically spent the first 4 or 5 years of my training basically doing everything wrong and learning terrible habits.
Wow.
And then once I learned what those habits were, I had to spend another few years trying to fix them.
Wow.
Some of those habits I haven't completely fixed. But again, there's different worlds. And in the world of gymnastics, let's say, and I never competed. I don't plan on competing. I love gymnastics. I love the control of the body you have to have. But as an athlete, especially at a high level, there's a huge price. So in gymnastics, it's about doing the biggest trick possible. When you enter the circus world, for example, you have to understand that most of the people watching can't count how many twists you did. They have no idea. So in circus world, actually, the tricks that look the best are usually simpler ones. So it's not about necessarily, and again, there's different levels. Some people, it is about doing the biggest trick, but usually it's not the biggest trick that looks the best. It's the simple ones that people can understand. So it's about making those look good.
Right. And kind of the extreme control that you see, especially with a lot of the Chinese circus performers, you see this unbelievable level of control over the body.
So what it comes into as well, for example, I've done tons of auditions and a lot of times I'm competing with that, especially when I auditioned for Cirque a couple of years ago. I did both the martial arts and the gymnast audition, and the gymnast audition was kids in their early 20s who were literally fresh from competition.
Wow.
So I still got cut. I made it a lot farther actually than some of the higher level gymnasts. The difference is that I threw simple stuff, but I threw stuff that I knew I could do 100% land clean, no question. Mm-hmm. And a lot of these guys were throwing big tricks that I wasn't necessarily comfortable doing, but they were crashing and they were getting frustrated. So there are different levels of that and different levels of refinement. But I don't want to say closing the gap, but there are things you can do that make you look better even though you don't have the same skill level necessarily.
So it's a bit of the kind of, I think Tim Ferriss calls it the minimal effective dose, figuring out what that 20% is. He gives the example of when he was a salsa dancer, or he was competing as a salsa dancer, and he would take these very long leg strokes that are just, 20% of the skill of leading as a salsa dancer, but it made 80% of the difference. Essentially how the judges perceived him. Is it kind of that situation in gymnastics?
Not as much in gymnastics, but more so in the performing arts world. Again, gymnastics, especially competing at a high level, it's a completely different beast. And the stuff that these guys are doing, you can't match it. But as an audience watching it, it may not be as impressive looking because most people won't appreciate the actual difficulty of the skill being performed.
Right, that's true.
Right. So, for example, a friend of mine, he posted just an act he did on, I don't even know how to call it. It's like an aerial hoop with a cane. So you look at the audience reactions, he did like a one-arm sequence where he went to meat hook and swish back and forth. And then he did one pass where he just hung from one arm and went up and down. And that got the biggest applause.
Right.
When literally he's just hanging from one arm.
Right.
But the audience, they can connect with that a lot better because it makes sense to them.
I see. You remind me, actually, I heard this great interview with Ido Portal, and he talks about gymnasts, and he says, you can't even play on the same playground as these kids. These kids aren't human, right? It's a totally different level of strength that they're exhibiting, and most people can't even understand it, much less match it, which I just think is so incredible. So when you train people, what's in your toolkit? I mean, what are kind of some of the essential items or gear that you need to get people, up on their hands, doing flips, stuff like that?
Honestly, nothing. I'm very minimalist as far as that goes. I mean, if I have a floor, it depends on what we're doing, right? If we have handstands, literally just a floor and a wall. And then there's a lot we can do if we have, let's say, a bar or a pair of rings to hang from. I do a lot of stuff with rubber bands as well, as far as like rehab, stuff like that. But
yeah, mobility type stuff.
Yeah. With tumbling, and again, I'm a minimalist, so I learned on the grass. I don't think big fluffy mats are necessary if you do the progressions right. And again, they can be very helpful, and it's not that I won't use them, but they're not necessary because if you want to do the movement on the floor, you have to learn what the floor feels like.
Right.
And again, it's not with everyone. Some people need that comfort, but if you get too used to the comfort, then it develops a different kind of fear. And anytime you have a fear or a mental block, it's a very different kind of training than actually physically working the skill.
Yeah.
So, and one of the first things I'll teach in handstands, tumbling, or anything is how to bail, how to fall. You have to learn that falling is part of the process and that falling is safe. And if you can fall on a surface that isn't flush, then you'll have no problem.
Yeah, definitely. That was a turning point in my own handstands. One time you fall and you kind of don't save yourself and you do this kind of tuck and roll and you get up and everything's okay and nothing's broken.
Yep.
And suddenly it kind of changes your outlook, I guess, on the whole thing.
Well, right. There's eventually you learn, especially in a handstand, there's different levels of, and in tumbling as well, right? There's different levels of falling that you can learn to save yourself from. So eventually you'll know, okay, I'm falling this much, but I have this much recovery ability and I can still recover from that. So there's different levels of falling and different levels of bailing. And the more control you end up having, the farther you can go into a fall and still be able to recover from that. But as far as, I think the question was about equipment. As far as equipment, so you'll see this in gymnastics gyms a lot in adult classes. It looks nice when you have all these fancy mats to fall off of. And again, they can be useful, but ultimately that's not the purpose. And it's just about, controlling the body and the mind compared to having more equipment to use.
Right. How much of it is just raw strength versus coordination and kind of, mental determination? I'm trying to understand what the breakdown is because obviously, I've seen you standing on one hand. Raw strength is a very, very large part of it, I imagine.
It's actually not. It's very little. And once you understand the technique, one of the cues I give is actually to try to be lazy. And a lot of the people I get who come from, let's say, a CrossFit background, people will always fall back on what they're good at. So if people are strong, they're used to using their strength, they overpower every movement. And as soon as they get into a position where they feel unsafe, they go right back into their strength. Interesting. But the goal is actually to find a position in hand balancing, but in tumbling and everything as well, where your own body can hold you up. In tumbling, there's not really a lot of strength involved, but there's a very quick timing. And if you don't master that timing and positioning, then you don't know how to transfer momentum. So that's when you have to use positioning rather than strength. So we talk about one-arm handstand, and it looks like there's a lot of strength, but a lot of people do use strength in it. But if you're talking about complete refinement of technique, it's about finding a position where your body can hold itself up. So there's a certain amount of shoulder strength to be able to hold everything in place, a certain amount of body tension, but it's the more body awareness you have, the less strength you actually have to use. And the technique I try to use is to be as completely relaxed as possible. So it's not about using strength. It's about knowing where your body is and knowing where to make and when to make those adjustments. The more strength you use, the easier it's going to be a little bit to balance. So there's some techniques, whether it's one arm or two arms, where you can lean into your shoulders, you can bend, you can do a lot of techniques to make yourself lower. And it's really similar, like if you're standing on your feet, you're doing martial arts, for example, you'd be a little bit bent, a little bit grounded in your stance. This makes it more difficult for you to lose balance. What that actually does is it dampens the balancing sensations you need to feel. So it allows you to react a little bit slower, which is not what we want. Ideally, you want to be able to lock out so you can use less energy, but that requires a much faster reaction time. So there's a lot of, and it's easy to talk about handstand as a strength move, but it's not. There are strength moves that come in and out of it, that come from it, but the handstand itself, so the one-arm handstand it's complete skill work. It's about knowing where to position yourself and having very good awareness of the body and space and being able to manipulate that.
I imagine that for you, your wrists are very, very important considering you spend a large portion of your day on them.
Yeah, absolutely.
So how do you go about protecting your wrists and I guess protecting your joints as a whole? Are you kind of doing these crazy Chinese wrist push-ups that I've seen some martial artists do, or?
I do them to show off. Like I watched, all the old Drunken or Jackie Chan movies, Drunken Master, Snake and Eagle Shadow, all of that. So I saw all of those. It's more of a party trick than I think, but I do have a very extensive wrist and finger sequence that I use because not only am I gripping the floor and I'm on my hands, but I'm an aerialist as well. So I do a lot of hanging, which is even more grip work. So I do a lot of soft tissue work on the wrist and forearms. Again, my wrist and finger sequence that I use. When I teach it, it takes probably over half an hour.
Oh, wow.
Just to explain all of the movements. But it hits every angle of the wrist. It hits places that you didn't think could be stretched.
Wow. So this is a warm-up routine or it's a strengthening routine for the wrist?
It's both. It's a warm-up, but it includes both range of motion and strengthening in those ranges of motion. And again, it takes me maybe 5 minutes to do it because I have it down. But if I'm teaching it, it takes half hour or more just to explain all the different variations. And again, when you're teaching a group, you'll have different people who are less flexible or more flexible or who can demonstrate different ranges, and it's all that. One range in particular, it's not something I noticed when I was coaching kids, so I would love to go back and see what the numbers are. But in adults, I noticed it's about 50-50 where there's two finger flexibilities, right? There's one where it's the wrist in relation to the forearm and then the fingers in relation to the hand. And I noticed that about 50% of adults are missing the flexibility of getting the fingers 90 degrees in relation to the meat of the hand.
Yeah, guilty. I'm doing it right now and I'm getting about 80 degrees.
And that actually makes a huge difference in the handstand balance because the hand position that you want requires that flexibility. And people who are missing that, they can't put enough of their hands on the floor to make as powerful of a grip, which means they don't have as much surface area contacting the floor, and then they can still balance, but it's a little bit more difficult.
Right.
It's like if you were to if you were to over supinate your ankles and be on the outside of the foot, it's kind of a similar sensation where you can still balance, but you have less surface area, so you can't feel the floor as well.
Interesting. It makes a lot of sense.
But just as well, I'll use the gyro ball. It's awesome. I thought, it was a gimmick. It was a toy. And I tried it. I'm like, oh, this is a great grip and wrist warm-up.
That's the one that kind of rotates in your hand?
Yeah.
Interesting.
So that's great, and that's easy to travel with. The rice bucket is not easy to travel with, but I think it's fantastic for wrist rehab, for strengthening your hands and fingers from every angle. The idea in the rice bucket is that you jam your hands in and you're moving them around, but any direction you move in, the rice acts as a viscous fluid and it resists you. So you get resistance from every direction. And again, that's more of a kung fu thing, jamming your hands into rice, but very effective, I think, for wrist strength and rehab.
That's really cool. It actually makes me wonder because you've mentioned now bands and you've mentioned also soft tissue work. I recently wrote an article on ART and foam rolling and voodoo flossing, and all that stuff. And I'll put it in the show notes for people who have no idea what the hell we're talking about at this point. But it's definitely at the forefront of my mind. Mobility that we've, already kind of covered a little bit with the wrists, but also injury prevention. So I'm wondering a bit about kind of for the rest of your body. Obviously, wrists are a very sensitive point, but how are you keeping the rest of your body functioning optimally? Are you spending a lot of time on foam rollers? Give me an idea of that.
I spent some time on foam rollers. I was unlucky or lucky in the sense that I was very lucky that I never had a serious injury I needed to have surgery for, but I was close a couple times. And it was like a good wake-up call that, okay, I'm in my early 20s. I want to be able to do this for a long time. I love what I do. So what can I do to not be injured again?
Right.
And of course, that's relative. You still get injured. There's some things you can't prevent.
Right.
But just learning how every part of the body works and where it sits. And what it comes down to more, it's not so much protocol, but it's awareness. Like I've noticed it's not something I really understood when I was younger, but I have very loose joints. My knees, my ankles, my shoulders, they pop out of socket when I don't want them to.
Yep.
So especially my shoulders, like I have to be very aware of when they're in and out of the socket. And some days I have to set them before they feel like they can really take a good load.
Wow.
So there's different protocols. I do a lot of joint rotations, a lot of mobility type stuff as a warm up, or just even during the day when I'm standing, just basic stretches. So that's kind of a consistent thing. And then just like falling, that there's a certain of injury or tweak and certain protocols that you have for them. So if I were to tweak my shoulder, there's a protocol that immediately I'd use that involves, again, some band work, some blood flow work, et cetera, et cetera. Like a couple months ago, I was in jiu-jitsu class and I don't know how, but I sprained my ankle. So again, right away, say, okay, well, what can I do around that? How can I still train? And then how can I train while rehabbing this injury as much as I can? But most injuries, I think, they're not necessarily from being underprepared. It's more just awareness. And anything you do, you have to know the risk involved and is it worth it?
Right.
And again, looking back at most of the injuries that I've had in my time, I was like, should I have done that trick without warming up? Probably not. Maybe I should have taken some more time. But that's what it comes down to. Most of the injuries that I've had were just, they weren't from not being prepared. Like, yeah, I could have done more ankle and more wrist work, more knee work, but more so they were just from being stupid.
Yep. I knew that I was beyond the limit of what my wrist wanted to be doing when I injured it. And, I said, there's a 20% chance that I'm not going to get completely injured right now,
Yeah.
And lo and behold, a month later, I'm still babying it.
And honestly, a big part of it is being able to shut down your ego and knowing when to quit.
Yeah.
Like when to stop for the day. And you can stop for the day and still be able to train the next day, or you can do that little bit more. And it's always, right, coming from a tricking background, to go take a bunch of pre-workouts, go do a late night gym session, they're shutting off the lights. We're like, no, one more trick. And it's that one more trick is when people die.
So another question, we've covered the prehab, post-hab, all that stuff. I'm really curious about your nutrition because, obviously your body mechanics are very important. And I imagine if you add weight or take off weight here and there, it throws things off quite a bit. So what diet are you following? What are you recommending to your students?
It's like anything. There's one thing that I've learned from trying a lot of different stuff is that there's nothing universal. Nothing will work for everyone. And that's some of the articles that I've seen as well about diet is like, what they found is that human beings can thrive on a variety of different diets. There's nothing. So for a while I was strict paleo and I followed all the different stuff. Right now, I wouldn't say I'm strict to anything. I follow more or less paleo and then, a little bit of carbs thrown in there, white rice, quinoa, and, dark rye bread. And what I've been told by some people as well is that as you get older and your immune system gets a little bit compromised, there's certain foods that start to give you allergic reactions. And in my late 20s, I'm just starting to pick that out. So it's just still a constant process. But I mean, in my recommendation, if you can cook the majority of your own food, you're much better off than 99% of the people out there.
Definitely.
You can actually buy ingredients and put your food together, then you know what's going into it, and it's your own work and your own labor.
Right.
So one thing that I try to do is just avoid eating out as much as I can. Just try to cook for myself almost every meal.
Wow, that takes quite a bit of discipline.
Well, once you get used to it, it's rather enjoyable.
Yeah, no, I'm a big fan of cooking as well. It's just, I tend to like to cook in bulk. So, I'll cook Indian food from scratch, which is a fairly decent amount of work. I'll try to cook enough for 6 or so meals, and then I'll kind of freezer pack them for quick consumption.
Right.
What about nutritional supplements? Do you take any? Do you recommend any?
I do some, but it's not, I wouldn't say I have a pharmacy that I'm always dipping into. I do some multivitamins. I'll do some protein powders. I'll mix in some BCAAs, creatine here and there.
Right.
I wouldn't say there's any one that really made a massive difference, but
Really?
like anything, I'm constantly messing around. I'm constantly experimenting with it, but I definitely don't rely too heavily on the supplements. If they're there, they're there, and I'll take them. But part of it might just be psychological.
Sure.
That if the back of my head thinks they're working, they might be doing something.
Sure. One of the only ones, for me that has really made a difference has been beta-alanine, which kind of essentially prevents you from getting sore and thereby allows you to train harder sooner.
Yeah.
That one makes a really huge difference for me. But the rest of them, I can't say that I could isolate the performance difference from creatine or even protein powder. If you're eating a high protein diet,
right,
it's kind of superfluous, I've found.
Yeah.
What do you think are the 3 biggest mistakes that people are making when it comes to their fitness and health?
3. Okay. So one is trying to put a time frame on something. They say, okay, I want to learn the skill. I want to learn a handstand by the end of this month, the end of this year. Mm-hmm. That's a frame of thought that I don't think will get someone very far, because what happens when that time frame is over, right? Or what happens when you've achieved that skill? What do you think is achieving that skill? And in something like a handstand, it's like, a few years ago, I said, I want to achieve the one-arm handstand, and I've learned a lot, but I don't think it's like the more you learn, the more you find that there is to go. So if you're really committed about something, whatever goal that may be, losing weight, running 5 miles, getting a one-arm handstand, that should be a part of your lifestyle. It shouldn't be something you just put aside into a time frame.
Right. Although you called me out, I have a board here full of all these things that I want to be able to do within the next 6 months, like 50 double unders. I want to get into half lotus, then get into full lotus and, the straddle press. But I can see the logic in what you're saying, that you kind of have to be compassionate with your body.
Yeah, have the skills in mind, but I hate that idea of setting time frames. There's so many stuff out there where you learn this in X amount of time, and it's like, realistically, to learn any skill properly, you have to give it a couple of years. I know, I take some dance classes, right? And some of the questions, the ballet instructor gets, for example, like, oh, well, how long is it going to take me to hold my leg up as high as you? And maybe do ballet all your life and then find out.
Right.
But it's the same. I've gotten the question once, well, when can I expect to hold a handstand in the middle of the room? So I don't know, when you put the work in.
Right. I get that same question with the accelerated learning and the speed reading class. It's like, well, when am I going to be able to remember a list of 30 items in 2 minutes? Well, I don't know. You start from a different place than everyone else starts.
Yeah,
and I have no idea how much work you're actually putting in. I know for me to be able to do that, it took a hell of a lot of work. So.
Yeah. And in my experience, I knew if I wanted to do something, I knew I wanted to do that. And how long it took me didn't matter, right? It took me to learn a backflip probably about 6 months. And,
Wow.
That involved a lot of jumping to the side, a lot of landing on my head, a lot of watching the couple videos that were out there at the time.
Right.
On it.
With 56K modem.
Right. And when I learned it, I had all these bad habits. I would squat low. I would throw my head to the side still. So what do you call learning that? I learned it and I could land it, but maybe it would be another couple of years before it was clean to what my standards are today.
Uh-huh.
Right. So some people I've taught backflip again in one day who were athletic enough who could get over that fear, and one day versus a couple of years. But if you're really serious about something, the time doesn't matter. It becomes a part of your lifestyle. Right. And that goes into kind of number 2 is they kind of separate whatever their goal is. They separate it from their life. They say, I want to lose weight, but I'm going to work, and then I'm going to work on my cardio. Mm-hmm. But they're kind of interchangeable. Or the last point and this point is that I think the reason that I've seen, I don't want to say success because that's a very broad topic, but some of the reason that I've seen some success is that I've always had a very obsessive personality. So if I wanted to do something, it wasn't just in the back of my head, it was a part of my life actively. Like when I was learning one-arm handstands and obsessed with them, I would lean against the wall, just standing and waiting for something and pretend that I was balancing, on that one arm and moving my fingers, moving my hand around. So it was whatever I wanted to do was not just who I was when I was training, but it was a part of my everyday life. So you have to think 24/7, right? You're always training, you're always recovering. What can you be doing for that?
Right. And it's a holistic approach.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not something necessarily has to take time out of your day, but you have to always be thinking about where you're trying to get to.
That's so interesting. Well, and they say like physical performance gains, they don't happen in the gym. They happen, when you're sleeping, and they happen in the kitchen, right?
Yeah.
And so it's like all the other things that you're doing with your body are really going to make the bulk of the difference so that your training is effective, that 10% of your time you spend training, or probably in your case significantly more than 10%, but it's about making that time effective and not reversing the progress that you're doing in the gym every time you sit at your desk for 8 hours with your hips completely deactivated.
Yeah, absolutely. I had one more. A lot of people don't know how to judge progress. Right. So I wrote a couple posts on this. I don't know how clear they were, but there's many different ways to judge progress. And one of them is, okay, I learned a new skill, right? I learned a new trick. But what about the tricks you do have? How much better can you do them? The entries, the approaches. So a lot of people in their quest for whatever their goals are, they only see progress as a linear pattern. They only see, okay, if I can do a handstand press and I have that goal, what about holding the bottom of the press? What about holding isometric? What about a negative press? What about just holding a handstand cleaner with less movement? So there's a Louis West podcast. So Louis West, again, amazing acrobat. If you watch his videos, he does some amazing, amazing stuff. He had a podcast a while ago where he talked about kind of vertical versus horizontal development. Mm-hmm. And I really liked the way he explained it. So you can learn a new skill, or you can take the skills you have and you can develop them in a different way, right? You can take a cartwheel and you can learn a new skill out of that. You can do a cartwheel to a backflip, or you can do different cartwheel variations. And there are thousands of cartwheel variations that don't necessarily. So I think a lot of people in their goals aren't really clear about how to judge progress. And in my world, for example, I haven't necessarily learned a lot of new tricks in the last year, trick-wise, and some people may say, well, you haven't gotten better. Well, a lot of the things I'm learning are about performance quality, presentation of the tricks, cleanliness, transitions, getting in and out of that. So even if I haven't learned any new tricks, I've learned how to make the tricks that I do have count, and that's still progress. Or even if you understand something better, right, that's still progress. So a lot of people think that, the only way I'll make progress is if I lose 20 pounds, if I hit that 5-mile mark, if I hit a double body weight snatch.
Right.
And again, there's many different levels. So you can't get discouraged if you didn't hit that goal, because there's still progress that has probably been made just through the learning process of trying to get there.
Definitely.
Does that make sense?
Definitely. I think a lot of times people hit a plateau and decide. I was actually reading a book yesterday about language learning, of all things, and just how do you, once you're functional at a language, or in this case a skill, like I can go up on my hands, I can walk, all that stuff. It's super hard to motivate yourself to go to that next level. It's much more tempting to try something new, like the straddle press or the one-arm handstand, when really I should definitely be focusing on stability in the handstand and stuff like that.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's always something to work on. And that's in this world, in the world of body weight skills, there's never a point at which you can say that, okay, I'm done, I've stopped. So there's always a level further, or there's always a level backward that you probably haven't been to yet, which is why, like for my seminars, I love to have all different levels. And a lot of times I'll get that right. I'll get a lot of people who literally haven't done a handstand in their life, and I'll get a couple of people who are working towards one arm. Mm-hmm. And so for the basic people, they can learn from the beginning where this should be going and what process they should follow. For the advanced people, there's still refinement that they could be doing and that they need to be doing that's often overlooked. And just as well, it's just as useful for the beginner to see what can happen when you get advanced, and it's just as useful for the advanced practitioner to see where the basics are and maybe where they lie, where their basics could be better.
Right. If we imagine kind of the average listener sits at home, works out 3 to 4 hours a week, sits stationary for at least 12 hours a day, as most of us do, what do you think are some of the first and most impactful steps that they can take to kind of turn around their physical health, specifically like daily habits or stretches that stand out to you as really, really effective? I
think the worst thing you can do in that situation is just to be static. So I hate sitting at the computer, and I had a job where I kind of had to for a while, but I hate being static, so I always have to move. So if I'm sitting in one position for a few minutes, I change positions. And just that act of changing positions every so often will be enough to keep your body guessing. But the hip flexors are a major issue. Most people, especially who sit at desks, can't fully extend their hips, which causes a lot of other issues. So it's really simple. If you look up Kit Laughlin's work, he has some great stuff. You got standing hip flexor stretch. So literally you can stand up at your desk, every 20 minutes, and you can get in a hip flexor stretch, and that's already enough to counteract some of the damage you're doing.
Right. Is that kind of like a couch stretch type thing?
It's more just a standing lunge, but there's a sequence to it. So think standing lunge. You don't have to go that deep, but you square off your hips, you tuck the tail, so you're not arching lower back, right? The extension of the lower back is one of the compensations the body makes for not being able to extend the hips, but still getting upright. So it's about squaring your hips, flattening the back, and then leaning back into that leg. And once you feel that you've lost either the squareness of the hips or the lower back, you do it again. You find the position again, and then you continue leaning back. So it's a very effective stretch you can do, and it's not too high profile. So if people are watching you, you probably won't get that many dirty looks compared to some other stretches you can do. The other one is you can do just a seated piriformis stretch. Like for me, piriformis is actually probably one of my tightest. Basically just crossing your leg in a figure four and leaning over it back and forth to the side. And that's when you can do in your chair.
Oh yeah. I love that one. And I try to sit, like I said, I'm trying to get to lotus. Heaven knows if it's ever going to happen, but that's exactly what I'm doing on the occasions when I do sit.
Yep.
Are you a standing desk guy? I know you probably don't spend much time in front of a computer at all, but when you do.
I try. I have the chair, but I go back and forth. So maybe I'll spend a few minutes sitting in the chair. I'll take it out. I spend a few minutes kneeling. I spend a few minutes in lunge. So it's a sitting desk, but I would say I sit in it maybe 20% of the time that I'm on the desk.
That's awesome. And I imagine in your work, I mean, if you have a lazy day and you sit, in front of the TV for 8 hours, running a Netflix marathon, you probably can feel the difference in the tightness and mobility of the joints the next day.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's something, and that's another thing, especially with handstands, that you can feel a bit better because the body changes from day to day, balance changes from day to day, and it could be even that you ate something. Maybe you don't, like, I don't really drink, but once in a while I'll have a glass of wine. Maybe I'll have 2 glasses of wine. I can feel that the next day in my balance.
Wow. Yeah, and alcohol is one of those things, it kind of affects, I don't have the studies to back it up, but it kind of affects your inner ear and your balance and coordination absolutely. And everything. We've all had that kind of like wobbly feeling the morning after.
Yeah, and that's another thing, just being inside your body and knowing who you are, you can, once you have that awareness, you can understand how the body changes from day to day. And it can be completely different.
Yeah. And that's an amazing skill to have, is to spend that much time. I think that's really one of the appeals of yoga, is when you spend so much time observing your body's function and performance, you really start to understand the changes over time. Mm-hmm. So speaking of yoga, actually, I'm curious, we've talked a little bit about CrossFit. We've talked a little bit about yoga, capoeira. What do you think are the better exercise programs for people to participate in? Is it a mix of things? Is there one kind of regimen that you really recommend?
There's not one regimen, because what we get into is there's no one perfect form of movement. Gymnastics is great, but it creates its own limitations. Yoga the same, powerlifting the same, capoeira the same. There's a lot of good things in all of them, but there are also, if that's the only thing you do, you will have limitations in your body.
Right, of course.
The one thing that people tend not to do is to do what they're weak at. So, for example, really common in the yoga community, you'll see people who already have very loose joints. Yeah. Right. They go to a yoga class. They get told, "Oh, you're so amazing. You're going to be such a good yogi." And they continue going to that yoga class when, in fact, they need to be hitting the weights to actually tighten up their joints for safety. And it's the opposite, right? You get the strong guys who go into the gym. They can put up numbers really fast, but their movement is like a board. They're the ones who need to be in the yoga class.
Yep.
Ultimately, it's about finding what complements your weaknesses. And it's the same thing with capoeira, for example. Capoeira is an amazing form of movement, and there's nothing really quite like it. But if you do only capoeira, there's still a lot of limitations on the body. There's no pulling. some of the movements you learn acrobatically, or for example, like handstand or push-up, they're not necessarily taught properly.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to get too far into it, but
No problem.
part of it is having a teacher that knows what they're doing as well, because any of these movements, while they are amazing, there are a lot of misinformed teachers out there, and sometimes the students aren't aware of that, so they can learn techniques that aren't ideal. But really, to do as much as you can. The ultimate thing is that you enjoy what you're doing, and that, number one, and then number two, that you're doing something that works on your deficit.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And I love the story about the weightlifters, because I know a lot of those. I think I'm probably guilty of that myself, that, I weight train 6 days a week, maybe once a month, actually make it to a yoga class.
Yeah, and it's just the body, it's on the mind. The easiest thing to do is to feed your ego to do what you can already do.
Sure.
And it takes a lot more to go into something that you'll struggle at.
I love this story by Kelly Starrett. He talks about, one time he goes into a yoga class just for giggles. And, Kelly Starrett, for those who don't know, is a mobility expert, I guess is what you would call him, kind of very known in the CrossFit community for helping people with joints and flexibility and movement and stuff like that. And the guy's huge and very, very strong. And he walks into this yoga class and kind of gets this look from the teacher, and then sits in the back of the class and is able to do all the positions. I mean, he's probably one of the more mobile people in the classes. And the woman comes to him and says, I had no idea you were a yogi, and I'm so sorry if I gave you any attitude. And he goes, I'm not, I lift heavy all day, but I actually do my mobility work. I actually maintain my muscles. So actually, that raises another question. Who are some people's work that really inspires you?
There's so many. And at this point, I'll say more who inspired me in the early days when there wasn't that much available, because now it's like you can look at anybody and you can find inspiration. Dick Hartzell for me was a big one. So I met him at the Arnold Classic, and this is a guy who was 70 years old and who could drop down at the splits with no warm-up.
Oh, wow.
So he looks like the average grandpa, but he's super flexible, super passionate about what he does. And this is the guy who was really the first person to bring the bands, like the loop bands and the compression bands. I think now, Rogue calls them the Voodoo Floss bands, but those were originally Dick Hartzell stuff.
You're kidding.
So if you look, he has a book as well. It's called Don't Ice That Ankle Sprain, or something to that effect. And it's, again, fantastic method where for grade 1 sprains, you add compression and then traction in both directions, and it's amazing for relieving ankle injuries.
Right, so moving around the fascia, stuff like that. Interesting, yeah.
But again, this is a guy who, he's not a dancer, he's not a gymnast, he was a football player and then a football coach. So, and again, this guy, like literally no warm-up, just drops into the splits aggressively.
That's super interesting, because usually these guys, especially competitive athletes, they have intentionally trained, and I was talking with one of my trainers about this recently, they've intentionally trained in this deficit. Like a lot of runners don't want hip mobility, and they want very tight hamstrings. They want very tight calves because that's what's giving them their springiness.
Right.
Gymnasts obviously want the all around, but a lot of basketball players don't want mobility in certain joints. What are your thoughts about that?
It's about knowing, if you're willing to make those sacrifices, then if it's worth it to you, absolutely go for it, right? If you're willing to sacrifice a little bit of ankle health for $50 million a year and that's worth it to you, right? It's the same in the world of like circus and hand balancing. You'll see a lot of hand balancers who specifically starve their legs. And in hand balancing, or a lot of, straps and aerial, basically any leg mass is ballast. You don't want it.
Wow.
So
what does that look like?
I was in an audition with a guy who is probably one of the best hand balancers in the world, amazing. He can be like, he does some of the tricks, the higher level power tricks, and he never falls. I can go on all day, but the point is, in that audition, we had to do a standing broad jump for distance. He was having trouble with it. So I asked him, like, hey, do you ever train your legs? Like, no, what do I need to train my legs for?
Wow. So basically, like, absolutely no leg workout ever.
Yeah. None. Like, and some even go to the point where like they don't take stairs because they're afraid.
Wow.
And again, it's just up to you if it's worth it for the sacrifice. Like for me, my legs grow very easily. I've always had pretty big legs, and even when I didn't really train legs that heavy, they were still a good size. For me, it's not worth sacrificing leg strength and leg power for other skills.
Yeah.
But for some people, it is. And if it's worth that sacrifice for you, then you have to know what that sacrifice is and what it can do to you. As long as you're aware, then, it's your body and it's your choice.
That's super interesting. And it comes back to the kind of the yogis who can't squat half their body weight, but can do a full lotus.
Right.
So actually, speaking of this kind of amazing guy who never trained his legs, in all your years of working with gymnasts and athletes and all these kinds of really amazing people, what are some of the most superhuman feats you've seen? I mean, probably things that I've never even heard of, but...
I'm seeing some crazy stuff, and it keeps, like, there's more and more crazy stuff. But again, so the same guy who never trained his legs, the movement that he could do that basically you've only seen the Chinese hand balancers do this, so it's a completely different realm. And this guy's Cuban, and he can do this now very clean for reps. So from a one-arm elbow support, it's a pretty common move among high-level hand balancers from a one-arm elbow support, which is, we call it crocodile, to use the legs and kick into a one-arm handstand. So that's like a super power trick, but a lot of people do that. This guy presses from there into a one-arm handstand.
Oh my God. Right, so it's just all deltoid.
It's so much. It's so much about balance. It's much about strength and arching the body in the right way and putting it in the right position. But again, this is a move that it looks amazing when he does it, and you still can't appreciate how difficult it is.
Oh, of course not. Of course not. What's this guy's name? I'm dying to look up a YouTube video.
Roilan, Roilan Hernandez. I don't think he uses his last name, but he performs here and there. But again, yeah, it's amazing hand balancer. And this is a guy who, for him, walking on his hands is like walking on our feet, right? He doesn't need to warm up. He kicks up to one arm whenever he wants. He can balance on anything.
Wow.
And he's also one of the guys who has been doing it, probably walking on his hands as long as he's been walking on his feet.
Oh, wow. So trained as a child kind of situation.
Yeah.
Interesting.
And what it comes into as well, especially training as an adult, there are some levels that you just can't get to unless you have been training as a child. But as long as you know where you can get to and what those sacrifices are.
I get the sense that, with the classes you're teaching and the training you're doing, it's not about being the most elite athlete. It's about having a lot of fun and learning about your body. One of the main reasons I wanted to interview you is you're teaching people to do feats that seem superhuman. And you're teaching, everyday Joes to do it, which is really cool. I mean, if you can do a backflip and you can walk on your hands, that's a pretty awesome skill that a lot of people can't do.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's all it is that you don't have to be a gymnast or a circus performer to know how to use your body.
Yeah, definitely. So Yuri, what are you working on right now and what's in store for the future?
What I've been doing more recently is getting kind of back into, I've been doing capoeira a little bit more seriously as well and getting back into aerial. So I've been working on some duo straps the last couple months. Got some aerial gigs coming up. I'm going to Australia for 6 weeks from the end of February to the beginning of April, doing a tour there with tons of seminars and workshops.
Awesome.
So that's what I'm mainly focusing on right now. And of course, when you travel, you can't really train properly, so I'll have to modify what I'm doing.
Of course. Ideally, how much would you train every day if you got paid to train and nobody ever, requested workshops? How many hours a day do you think you'd train?
It depends on the day, but probably about 4 or 5 hours a day.
Oh, wow.
But again, it depends, right? So if you're doing skill work, like for example, once you have a handstand where it doesn't take energy to do and you're working towards one arm, you don't want to use energy in that one arm because you need to be able to practice it for a few hours if you want to get better at it.
Uh-huh.
Right? So a lot of it ends up being skill work. It's draining on the body, but you've built the body up enough where that basic skill work is.
I see. So you're not dealing with this kind of glycogen depletion, of these long workouts.
No, not as much. And just as well, what I try to do, because I do train pretty much every day, is I never go full out. I don't want to say all my workouts, but for the most part, everything that I do is very sub-maximal because I know I'm going to have to do it again the next day. So it's about leaving a little bit in the tank because you have to do it again the next day. If I'm going on a 24-hour flight to Australia, I'll probably kill myself the day before so I can just sleep it out on the plane.
Interesting.
But for the most part, I think, and again, it's that concept of knowing when to stop, is that not every training session has to deplete you.
Right. Sometimes it's about maintenance.
Yeah. And sometimes it's about, if we're doing, pure skill work, you don't want fatigue to the mix for a while. So either with handstands or tumbling, for example, like one of the stories I heard, and I could be wrong about this, I could be paraphrasing completely wrong. So this guy Velu, who's a Finnish guy, one of the best trickers in the world, is doing crazy, crazy movements, right? He was interviewed a couple of years ago about how he trains. And again, I could be very wrong about this, but this is what I heard. And he said, every day I go hard for an hour, and then when the hour is up, I stop. I don't do anything more.
Wow.
And that was his training method. That's really a good way because you can keep up your intensity without bringing fatigue into the mix. As soon as fatigue comes in, it's a completely different game that we're working with.
Right, and that's where you're getting injured as well, as we said earlier on.
Getting injured or just building bad habits for the future.
Yeah, and I've noticed that a lot as well. Like when your muscles start, it's the peripheral muscles, right? You start to get fatigued and suddenly you're not controlling, you're not supporting, you're not,
right.
As Kelly Starrett likes to say, you're not organizing your spine correctly.
And there's a time when you do want that, where you are working endurance and you're specifically pushing how long you can do something. And at that point, your form will go. It's just about understanding when to put that in. And if we're doing skill work, it's usually not for a while. It's usually not until you already have a base of good technique that you can fall back to.
Yeah. So I'm actually very interested in starting to get into gymnastics and stuff like that. What would you say are kind of the first steps if I want to, just as a hobby to be able to do cool stuff and enjoy my body a little bit more? What are the first steps? It's probably very much recommended to attend a class, find the right teacher.
It's one of those things that you don't need it. You can learn without it. I did, but hands-on assistance is really important. But it's important to go to the right place and the right teacher. Because, again, some gyms you'll go to that have adult gymnastics class, they're just going to have you fall on a mat for an hour. And it's not, I don't think that's the right learning process. So you have to go to the right place. But part of that as well is being able to learn from different teachers. And if they have you fall on a mat, you can still learn something from that. Any basics that you can work on without having to go to a gym for, like cartwheels, handstands, handstand rolls, all of those. Like I can do a whole seminar on cartwheels and their variations in mechanics.
Right.
And again, when it comes into like tumbling and floor gymnastics and stuff like that, there's a lot of placement and timing issues that are important.
Yeah.
But definitely getting some hands-on help is the way to go, especially if you're looking to do a skill where, like a backflip, where there is a bit of risk involved. Getting a spotter for that, or at least someone who can explain it to you a little bit better, can make a huge difference.
Yeah, I think I need to do that. So you're traveling around quite a bit. You also do, I believe, online training and stuff like that. Yeah?
Correct.
So for people who are interested in getting in touch and learning some lessons from a self-taught pro, how do they get in touch with you? How can people learn more about what you're doing?
Most of my stuff I put on either my website or on Facebook.
Okay.
So my Facebook, you would just search my name, I think, or if you go to facebook.com/Yuri.Marmer. My website is Yuri-Mar, so Yuri-Mar.com.
Awesome. And we'll put it in the show notes just to make it easy for people. And that brings us back to the workshops. And I assume you have a schedule up on your website.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. Cool. So we'll make sure to post that in the show notes. And Yuri, thanks so much for taking the time today. It was a real pleasure chatting with you.
Yeah, it was fantastic.
All right. Take care.
Yep, likewise.
Thanks for tuning in to the Becoming Superhuman podcast. For more great skills and strategies, or for links to any of the resources mentioned in this episode, visit www.becomingasuperhuman.com/podcast. We'll see you next time.